Hi, welcome to Psychosis. This is the first lesson we've uploaded. So if you like it, make sure you give us some feedback or just something so we know whether or not it's worth actually uploading the other lessons in the courses. So attachment is assessed on paper 1 of AQA psychology. So whether you're doing AS or an A-level, this is one of the core topics and you have to do it. So the first thing we're going to look at is caregiver-infant interactions. And when we look at this, we have to look at two key things, so reciprocity and interactional synchrony. Now, these are actually named on the specification. That means you've got no choice, you have to know them. You may be asked application questions about them, you may be asked to define them. There's a number of ways that you might need to use these. Now, the first thing we need to consider is, what actually is attachment? So we might think about, how can we define attachment? What does it even look like? So how would we observe it? How do we know if someone's attached? What research we can do to actually explore attachment and what research have other people done? And why is it important that we actually understand it? What's the point of research into attachment? And these are some of the key things we're going to explore a little bit throughout this lesson, and we have them in the following lessons that cover the whole of the attachment content. So we're going to start by looking at a definition which basically says that attachment is an emotional bond between two people where they both seek closeness and feels more secure when they're in the presence of the attachment figure. Now, what's really important as well is that psychologists believe that it's these early attachments that are really important for the basis of forming attachments in later life. So that's in childhood and in adulthood. So that's really important. So we need to consider what attachment actually looks like. So how would we measure it? And there are three key things we can look at. So proximity. So with this, people tend to stay quite close to those people that they're attached to. Separation distress. So an infant might become quite upset and cry if an attachment figure leaves the room, for example. And secure-based behaviour. So a child might be playing, but then they might keep returning to their attachment figure. So they've got regular contact. It makes them feel quite comforted. Now, just to go back to these two key concepts, reciprocity and interactional synchrony. So again, remember you have to know both of these. So reciprocity in simple terms is when the infant and caregiver try and get a response from each other. Okay, so it's a bit similar to a two-way conversation. So it's when they reciprocate each other's interactions, so that they take it in turns almost. Interactional synchrony is slightly different. So the infant and caregiver mirror what the other is doing. So this could include actions and emotions, and it's quite coordinated. So it happens more or less at the same time. So let's go into a bit more detail about these. So reciprocity. So Feldman says that, interactions become much more frequent from around the age of 3 months, and it's after this time that they start to pay really close attention to each other's verbal and facial expressions. So there's reciprocity. This involves responding to the action of one person with your own reaction. Though it might be similar, but it doesn't have to be. So the infant and caregiver, they take it in turns and it's quite two-way. So just as a quick example, a parent might smile at their infant, they might giggle in response, or an infant might giggle and a parent might tickle them to get them to giggle again. So it's really about responding to the cues that your child's giving you, the infant's giving you, and that's why you take it in turns. Interactional synchrony, on the other hand, is when we kind of mirror the actions. So it's synchronised, it's coordinated. So it's a bit like you'd witness in synchronised swimming. So they carry out the same action simultaneously, so it's at the same time. Now, this will only work if they are responding to each other's cues. So you have to think about the actual use of reciprocity within interactional synchrony. So you can't just keep them as two separate things, they work together. So, for example, a parent might poke their tongue out and an infant might mirror that or imitate it and poke their tongue out as well. So they do it at the same time, but they do have to respond to each other's cues to do this. Now, there's a really key study that you need to use as research into interactional synchrony, and this is Meltoff and Moore's study. They carried out a controlled observation, so a very controlled environment, controlled exactly what happened, so the procedure was really set out. And this was to research imitation in infants aged between 12 and 27 days, so they were really young. So what the researcher did was they demonstrated different stimuli to the infant. So they poked out their tongue, they opened their mouths really wide, they puckered their lips, so lip protrusion, and they made a hand gesture, so in this case opening the hand. Now what they wanted to do is to see if the infants would imitate their behaviour. Now all this was video recorded, so they had separate video footage on the infants' faces and separate ones on the researchers' faces or the adults' faces. And independent observers actually watched the video footage, and they were asked to record down every time one of the behaviours occurred. So they would have had a behavioural checklist, so, tick when this happens and what time in the video did it happen, which child did it happen to, etc. Now, their research actually did conclude that there was an association between the infant behaviour, so what they did, and what the adult model did. So they actually imitated each other. Well, not each other, but the baby definitely imitated the adult model, They later actually carried out a further study with infants just 3 days old, again getting similar results, and this might suggest that these behaviours are inborn, they're something we're born with rather than learned, so they're innate. So what we're going to do now is we're going to show you a couple of video clips. The one on the left is going to help show interactional synchrony, and the one on the right, reciprocity. So let's see what you think of the clips as we play them. The one on the left, you might have to keep your volume up. It's quite an old clip, so it's fairly quiet.
Xavier, hello.
Only 10 minutes old, Xavier's infant senses are bombarded with new sights, sounds, and feelings.
Good boy.
He watches his father pull faces, and then slowly responds. This isn't conscious mimicry. Xavier doesn't even know he has a face. But he's managing to translate what he sees into similar actions of his own.
Hello. You copy Daddy.
So really interesting clip there to show it in action. Now the one on the right, watch carefully and watch the little baby as she does get a little bit distressed, but not too much, and she is quieting down quite quickly.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
So a really nice real life example of why reciprocity is really, really important. And you can use this still face experiment as an example within your writing. That's absolutely fine. Now, as with any exam in AQA psychology, it's really important that you're able to fully evaluate. So I'm going to take you through 3 key evaluation points, and then you need to be able to write those into decent AO3 paragraphs in order to show the examiner that you can fully evaluate the theory. So for the first evaluation point, we're going to look at validity and reliability. So with Meltoff and Moore's study, it's really, really difficult to kind of find out whether or not the behaviour they observed was actually intentional. It could be that the babies did this merely by accident. So if you think about babies, they struggle to actually control their body movements. It's actually quite jerky, and they change facial expressions all the time. So it's really difficult to distinguish how deliberate the behaviour being shown actually is. So we can't actually be certain that interactional synchrony or any type of reciprocity is actually taking place. Now, although that's a weakness, you could say, though, that because they've used independent observers in the study, it does mean that the findings are not influenced by knowing what actions the researcher carried out, okay, and that increases internal validity. Also, the use of more than one observer increases reliability, so inter-observer reliability. So if they both record the same behaviour and they find like a match between both their recordings, usually anything above sort of 80% match, that shows really good inter-rater reliability. Furthermore, there was other research by Bravenel and Young, and they found that infants made little response to objects simulating tongue and mouth movement, so something that was made by an object, not a person, which does suggest that this imitation is specific to response to other humans. And this does therefore strengthen the idea that these responses are in fact intentional. If they weren't intentional, then this same research would be able to be carried out with objects imitating movements that adults do, but it didn't find the same thing. Also, the purpose is really not clear. So it's really good research, but it only describes the behaviour. It doesn't really say why they do it. However, there is other evidence that says the development of interactional synchrony is helpful because it helps develop a strong attachment between a mother and her infant. So that might mean there is a purpose after all. So if we look at Isabella's study, where they followed 30 mothers and infants, any interaction at high levels of synchrony were found, they actually associated this with better quality attachment overall. So it could be suggested that this is an innate thing that happens in infants, which is essential for their survival so that they can form that attachment. Now, there are other things as well that we need to look at. So the research is good because it was really controlled. Okay, and that was really good. And because it was videoed, it meant that we can really sort of analyse the detail to try and establish some kind of causation or at least a correlation between the two things. Also, with an observation like this, infants don't really know they're being observed. So, like with adults, they're not going to change their behaviour, they're not going to be influenced during the observation. So, demand characteristics don't really come into play as far as the infants are concerned. So, it increases the internal validity. Okay, so therefore the research is more certain that they're actually measuring what they intended to measure and their behaviour hasn't been altered in any way at all. However, it doesn't matter how valid the research is, it might actually have implications. It might be something deemed as socially insensitive, or socially sensitive rather. So, for example, if this research says that mother-infant interactions are really important, okay, and therefore the more time spent with the infant, the better, it might make mothers who have to return to work quite shortly after having children feel quite guilty or feel like they're disadvantaging this achievement of interactional synchrony and therefore the attachment with their child. So we have to be careful about how we report these findings because it can be socially sensitive.